Right, well, we moved on from Vienna to look at some other Austrian cities. As I think Sebastian mentioned, a quarter of Austria's population currently lives in the capital. So that gives you some indication of how small beer the other cities in the rest of today's Austria are. Because Austro-Hungary lost an enormous amount of territory, and some other very important cities such as Budapest in 1918. This is Graz, which has a population of 222,000 and is the capital of Styria, which is one of the southern provinces of Austria. And it's got a beautiful historic centre. You can see here the Marktplatz, which has some rather fine Baroque houses around it, and the City Hall in the middle. And off the main street are various very picturesque alleys and courtyards. This one is the Landhaus, which is the historic seat of the Styria province. And also off the side of the main street is this rather extraordinary Renaissance building attached to the cathedral, which is a mausoleum for some of the Austrian emperors. The Austrian emperors seem to have moved around quite a bit before they finally landed up in Vienna. They were in Innsbruck as well as here. But Graz is also distinctive for its more modern architectural innovations. For example, in the foreground here you can see the Kästner and Oehler department store, which has a very fine Jugendstil interior dating from the turn of the 20th century, and has been revamped by a young firm of architects in the 1970s, Szyszkowicz and Kowalski, who've done quite a number of other buildings in the city. And in the background you can see the archigram-inspired Kunsthaus or art gallery designed by Peter Cook and Colin Fournier. There's an interesting sideline there because, in fact, Sebastian, myself, Carla Kowalski and Colin Fournier and Willy Bossert, who I see sitting over there, were all 1968 alumni of the Architectural Association School of Urban Design and Planning. So it's a small world. But the active architectural scene in Graz has been recognised by its status as a UNESCO design city. And this is a view down onto the market square from a precarious glazed cantilever from the top of that department store that we were talking about. And you can see quite a lot of trams there. Graz, in spite of its small size, has got a network of 6 tram lines running through, most of which run through this main street. So the outer areas of the city are very accessible. This is close up of the archigram-inspired art gallery. I think it's quite controversial as to whether or not it fits in and whether or not it's so extraordinary that it's become something people are quite fond of, and is a contrast with the urban grain around. In the foreground you can see the river on the island, which is another modern architectural intervention. And this is the railway station, which has been recently revamped with a new station by Zechner and Zechner, who are quite leading Austrian architects. And in common with many other new Austrian stations in major cities, it has a huge underground concourse spanning the tracks, and the trams come in and provide interchange with the rail lines. I suppose Graz's other claim to fame is it's one of the strongholds of the right-wing Freiheit Party that have been doing so well with their xenophobic policies, and looks set to become part of a coalition with the Conservatives who won the recent general election in Austria. We then moved on to Linz. Linz has a population of 181,000, so it's a little bit smaller than Graz. But Linz, unlike Graz and some of the other cities, has a well-established industrial employment base, an independent art scene, and has commissioned quite a number of iconic new buildings, and has started building peripheral housing. Most of the other minor Austrian cities haven't felt a need to expand peripherally in the way that Vienna has. And this is the pedestrianised main square of Linz, which contains one of these plague columns which you find in various parts of Austro-Hungary. And there's a famous one in the centre of Vienna. It's built in the late 18th century to commemorate deliverance from the plague. And this is one of the modern architectural interventions, which is the Lentos Art Museum by architects Weber and Hofer. That dates from 2003, and it's on the Danube frontage. And another feature is the tobacco factory, a little bit outside the centre, which was designed by Peter Behrens, the pioneering modern architect of the early 20th century. The Behrens part is the long block on the right. It's been acquired by the city and is being transformed into workspaces and artistic uses. I think it's early days, there aren't that many uses in there as yet, but it looks an interesting project. And this is the peripheral housing that Linz is hosting. Solar City it's called, and that is due to have 4,000 residents. But as you can see, part of the principle is orientation towards the sun, which they reckon is pretty green and keeps the energy consumption to carbon neutral. The Solar City is also direct accessible by a new tram line or an extension to a tram line, so this follows on the Austrian principle of linking development to efficient public transport. Linz has got 3 tram lines which run through the centre. We then moved on to Salzburg. So these are all in decreasing size, these cities. Salzburg is 150,000. The picturesque old town is well known. It's very popular with tourists, and of course the music festival draws many people in. But as you can see, the urban form is that there's a river frontage, and then behind is the old Castle Hill, which has a funicular railway running up to it. And I'm afraid at this point the weather deteriorated sharply on our tour, so the pictures start to look rather gloomy. This is the view down from the Castle Hill, and you can see that a large part of the historic centre between the castle and the river Salzach was in fact appropriated by the Prince Bishops or Prince Archbishops, who in the late 18th century flattened a lot of the town and built this sort of huge residence palace complex using Italian architects, incorporating the cathedral and many other large public rooms. It's very grand indeed when you walk around inside. Salzburg hasn't got very many of the innovative architectural interventions that the other towns have. I think you could say Salzburg is pretty conservative in its conservation of what it's got. But this is the Museum der Moderne, which is a modern art museum on the opposite hill on the other side of the river from the historic castle, and it's attached to a neo-Gothic little castle, as you can see here, but the art gallery itself makes no concessions at all to the neo-Gothic. And then finally we moved on to Innsbruck. I'm afraid the weather was so bad here I've had to use other people's photos. The high point of Innsbruck is the Hofburg, which was the seat of the emperors before they moved to Vienna. And so you can see sort of early 18th century Baroque here with amazing alpine scenery in the background. And the main street, the Maria Theresienstrasse, is lined by some fairly fine Baroque and earlier houses, very impressive high buildings. But one of the interventions is a new shopping centre designed by David Chipperfield Architects, the Kaufhaus, which you can see on the left. And Chipperfield has cleverly picked up the slight undulation in the street frontages here and incorporated it into his building. So I think we thought that was quite successful. The other feature of Innsbruck, and again I'm using someone else's picture here, was a dramatic funicular railway going up to a nearby mountain, the Hungerberg, which was designed by Zaha Hadid, with these extraordinary wing-like structures for stations and entry points. By this point it's torrential rain, and then as we got on the train to go back the next day, the rain turned into snow. So although this was late April, as you can see, it's a winter wonderland to the extent that our train was held up. We failed to make our connection in Zurich and had to adopt a plan B to get back to London, otherwise we would have been stranded paying Swiss hotel prices in Zurich. So that's an overview of some of the smaller Austrian cities. So I think you can see that some of the emphasis on sustainability, use of public transport and so on is present in these other cities as well. I think they do have strong civic presence. They are all capitals of regions, so they have some administrative importance as well. But I think there's a sort of rather adverse political context to Austria in today's world. I think Vienna is probably out on a limb politically with its socialist traditions and its liberal views. When you come to some of these other cities, if you read the newspapers, there's a rather more xenophobic view of life. But that doesn't seem to reflect itself in the quality of the urban environment. If anyone has any questions.